In this video, we are going to create a metronome for our game. In order to make practice mode, you could say, a little bit easier, we're going to set up an actual audible metronome to go hand in hand with the visual beat marks that we are currently drawing inside of the game.
Okay.
This will make it a lot easier to get a feel for the current tempo. And we're also going to add in an additional sound while we're adding metronome, since we'll need to come up with a mechanism for adding sounds in addition to the ones that are represented by tracks. We'll go ahead and add a second sound, a basic click sound, and we'll use that to indicate note mispresses. So we're actually going to be looking at a few different events once we get all of our sounds loaded in. Now let's talk about the sound loading for just a minute. At the moment, we have a system where all of the sounds are based on tracks that the game recognizes. Even the sound engine is designed to play sounds by index, where that index correlates to a specific track. Now, in order to play sounds that are in addition to the tracks, the way we're going to handle this is we're actually going to load our tracks first, then load additional sounds into the sound engine, and remember the index of those sounds into additional variables.
Okay.
So that way we'll make some you can almost call them out-of-bound or out-of-range variables, not meant to address the tracks list, but they will be accepted by the sound engine to play the sounds that come after the series of tracks. Now we're also going to need a few settings. We're going to be allowing configuration for the metronome sound in the config file, because again, up until now, the tracks control what sound gets loaded. So we'll need to give ourselves a few extra sounds. And while we're busy making settings, we'll also create a setting that will allow us to turn the metronome on and off.
Okay.
So let's get started. The first place we're going to go is to the config XML file. And we'll scroll up to the top, just under time scale. We'll put together a series of options for the metronome. The first option we'll drop in is whether or not the metronome is currently active. So we'll create a new node called metronome active, and we will give ourselves a value attribute, and we'll set this attribute to true. So initially we'll set our metronome to be active. Now we'll drop in and add a second node. This will be metronome sound. And metronome sound will have a value of metronome.wave. Again, this correlates to the same kinds of files we're loading up for our tracks, and if we look back into our content project and jump into samples, we can see we have metronome wave, and we also have this click.wave, which we'll be loading here in just a second.
Okay.
So now we can end off the metronome sound node and add in one more node. This node is going to be called click sound, and it will have a value of click.wave. So it can end off our click sound. That takes care of the third option we need. So now we have both sounds that we can use to load into our game and an extra setting. Now, of course, to be able to use these, we need to add relevant fields in the config class and get them all loaded in and initialized. So from here, we'll collapse up our content project, jump to our game folder, and bring up the config class. We'll jump in here right after hit range and timescale and add a series of fields to correlate to our new config nodes. We'll add first a public static boolean field, public static bool metronome active. And let's see. Now we can take this field and copy it to duplicate it a few times. So we can also add in metronome sound index and metronome click index. So we're not actually going to be storing the names of those sounds. Again, we have no need of storing them because we're never going to draw the names metronome or click to the screen.
Right.
And our sound engine doesn't take things in by name, it takes them in by index.
By index, right.
So rather than remember the name of the sound as it appeared in the config file, we'll remember the position into which it was loaded in the sound engine. Alright, let's jump down to our load config section up here in load options, and we need to load in our metronome active setting. So we can simply duplicate our timescale line, and then we can instead address metronome active, and that will be equal to parse bool, and then we'll load in metronome active. And just as we were doing earlier, let's go ahead and check and make sure that the setting is getting loaded in just to prevent any problems later. So let's set a breakpoint on metronome active, run the game, wait till we break out, look at metronome active, which is false, hit F10 to step over it, and metronome active is true. So our setting is indeed loading in correctly. Now we're not yet going to drop in the metronome sound index and click sound index, because at this point we only have their name. We don't know where they appear in the sound engine. And we won't know where they appear in the sound engine until we actually load them. So at this point we need to move down to the load sound method. And here we have all of the code for loading sounds into our individual tracks. So what we're going to do is we'll jump in after we have loaded all the tracks in, and then we're going to turn around and resolve the names of each of these sounds and load them in addition to the tracks that are already loaded. At this point we already have a variable named sound file that we were reusing in the sound loading loop. As a matter of fact, we can probably steal some of this existing code. Looking at our track sound loading, we load the current name looking at the current sound value. If we look back at our config file, that was correlating to sound here in our track setting. This is where we were loading a WAV file. That's useful to us here because we also have the code necessary to combine that with the samples path and get ourselves an absolute path. And we take sound file, turn around, and load it. So let's take both of these lines and copy them and paste them here outside of the for loop. Only this time, instead of dropping in the current sound value, let's load in the value currently held in metronome sound and click sound. To do that, we need to run a getNodeValue call, because at this point node attribute sound came from inside of the loop. Outside of the loop, we don't actually have access to a node. So what we're going to need to do is run getNodeValue, then we can simply pass in the name of a node. And we need the current XML document, which is XML config, and the node path is going to be quotes / config options, and the first one will be metronome sound. Then we can finish off the parenthesis for our call to getNodeValue, then that value will get passed into our path.combine and finally stored in sound file. Then we turn around and load that file, and then we're ready to go. So at this point, just to make sure that all of our settings are getting resolved correctly, I'm going to set a breakpoint on sound file, and we'll run up to this point, where sound file is currently the last sound loaded into our tracks, which was ride.wave. If we hit F10, if we look to the very end of that, we're looking at metronome.wave. So everything seems to be loading in correctly. Alright, let's hit Shift F5 and jump out of this debug session. So that will take care of loading in our metronome sound. Now we just need to do the same thing for our click sound. So once again, sound file will be loaded from the option click sound. And once again, I'll go ahead and set a debug line just to make sure that we're dropping in here and seeing click.wave. Alright, with both of these loaded in now, we need to give ourselves some index variables that point to the proper elements in the sound engine itself. And we'll do that simply by noting the order that these were loaded and then storing that into metronome sound and click sound. So what we can do is after each of these lines that load in a sound, we can store the current last element of our tracks. Because an interesting point is that we don't have a facility to ask the sound engine how many sounds it has. So we'll actually look at our track nodes to know basically where our tracks end. So let's drop in the first one, metronome sound index. That is going to be equal to track nodes dot count. And again, track nodes here comes from all of the nodes we selected from the track section. So that's going to be the total number of tracks that we have. And of course, this is a zero-based list. So if we look at count, that's actually going to be one element past the end of this track nodes list, or the element that would come after the last track. And we'll store that value as metronome sound index. Now moving on from here, we need one element past our metronome sound index for our click sound index. So we can copy and paste this line, change it to click sound index. And looking up here, we have click. I see. When naming these, we left metronome in place. Let's change the name of this instead of metronome click index to something that makes more sense, like click sound index.
Okay.
So now we can say click sound index is equal to track nodes dot count plus 1. So at the moment, IntelliSense is a little bit unhappy with the fact that these are still bool. So that means we have just a few more copy paste errors to clean up. Let's change the type of these to integer, which would be exactly what we'd need for doing the necessary indexing.
Sure.
Alright, so with all of this put together, we should now have variables pointing at the correct elements that our sound engine is able to play based on the sounds loaded in addition to our tracks. So at this point, we should have the sound engine ready to go, and it's time to look at the game screen and pull in or rather look at the necessary events. So over here inside of screen game, if we scroll down to the reset method, this is where we're setting up all of our event handlers. Let's add a new event handler for beat. So we can jump in here to songs sub I dot beat, and then create a new handler. I'll change the name of this handler to song_beat. Again, just keeping with the naming scheme we have so far. Now, inside of the song beat handler, we want to make sure that the metronome is currently active before we attempt to play it. So we'll drop in an if statement, say if config.metronome active, then we'll go ahead and play. Now we do want to do one other thing. Again, since all of our event handlers get called per song instance, and multiplayer has 2 song instances, we want to make sure that we only play the metronome beat once. We don't want to replay the sound twice over itself. So we'll say that in addition to the metronome being active, we'll also make sure that we're only playing a metronome beat for song element 0. So we could say if song.playerIndex is equal to 0. If this is the case, then we can turn around and play the sound. We'll look at our sound engine, which is stored inside of global state. So global state.soundengine.play, and then we need to give the index of the sound, and that's currently held in config.metronome sound index. Alright, if everything is working as it should, we should be able to jump into the game, and check out our metronome sound. So let's jump in here, beginning with single player. We can grab the rock song, and now every metronome hit we get a nice click sound. We can see that that correlates with the actual beat lines that we're drawing to the screen. You also note that the metronome is playing even before our song starts, basically every time a beat goes by. So we get kind of a 4 count before we begin the song because of our lead-in time. So 2, 3, 4, then the song starts.
Cool.
And let's see, we can also test multiplayer very briefly just to make sure that everything still sounds correct. everything sounds fine. So there we have the song kicks in and begins playing.
Very nice.
Alright, one last thing we can do is put in a handler for note mispress. Since we have that additional sound called the click sound, we'll play that sound in the case where the user hits a button and there's no note to be hit. So one more time, jumping back up here to reset, let's put in a handler. So we'll grab songs sub I dot note mispress. We'll make a new handler, and again we'll change the name so we can say that this handler is called song underscore note mispress. And inside of note mispress we can play the click sound. So we'll look into our sound engine, global state dot sound engine dot play, where we'll drop in config dot click sound index. So now if we jump into the game and begin hitting notes before the notes actually start, we should hear additional sounds. Actually, let me find a slower song. So we can hit the snare note when the snare note's actually there.
But if you miss it, you're going to get that little clicking sound.
So now we do have a way to audibly indicate the event of the user mispressing a note. So with that, we now have our metronome complete. Again, this was just a matter of setting up the ability to configure our metronome and store the index of the metronome sounds. Once we had the ability to store sounds in addition to the track sounds, then all we had to do was go into our game, set up some handlers for some song events, and that took care of the metronome.
Very cool.